Welcome to the True Connections Recovery Podcast. I'm Brigham Elton. I am a pornography and sexual addiction counselor. We are going to help others to overcome pornography use, sexual abuse, and sexual fear by chasing healthy sexuality and being aware of the messages that are being sent to us sexually all around us. At times, these topics are hard to talk about, but our goal is to promote conversation and to help individuals feel understood and to help you feel like you're not alone. I'm so grateful you've chosen to be with us today. Chapter 2, Talking About the Mind. Now, this chapter starts on page 56 with some assessing your values questions. Now, again, I love these sections, especially in like a partnership for the two of you to talk about this because you come from different cultures and the way that sex and intimacy was taught in your homes was not the same. But as you talk about this, you can kind of consciously go through like, what about what I was taught and what I experienced do I hope to pass on to my kids? Because you are the primary setter of your child's culture, especially for these first few years. She even mentions that, right? At the very beginning, she talks about that like your brain is the most powerful sexual organ. The way you think about sexuality will determine how your children think about sex, from infancy all the way through adolescence and into adulthood. It's just like, hey, let's take stock here. Let's look at like how do we view sex. The first section is exploring sexual thought. And it talks about like what we learned from our parents, moral guidelines, sexual thoughts as a teenager, a lot of great questions for you and your partner to discuss. The one that I want to hit is this very first question. What lessons did your parents teach you about sex and sexuality, verbally or non-verbally? Now, I know that my parents had phenomenal intentions, right? And we're not trying to like come down on our parents that they like screwed us up, which, you know, all parents screw up their kids and that's okay. But what messages did I receive? That's what matters, right? Like what was my perception of what they were teaching me, right? And that is what I took in, and that's what I'm going to pass. And your kids are going to take what they think you're trying to teach them, and that's what is going to get passed. We have so many things teaching us like how to think about sex, right? Like what do you remember about your sexual thoughts as a teenager? And my memory is bad. Like I didn't even believe there was such thing as a healthy sexual thought. I thought of it as funny, as an opportunity to make jokes. I also thought that it was like cool to pretend like I was comfortable with it even though I wasn't. And that like any thought that I had internally was bad or maybe even evil. And I think talking about this as a partnership, you can make plans to send new messages to your children. Next was this exploring emotions. Now she says here at the very beginning, as you think about the emotion, this isn't something that you would be teaching to kids pre-puberty. This is going to be in like your mid-teen, and I would aim for kind of younger teen, like 13, 12, maybe even 11, where you would start teaching about the emotional side of sex. This is a piece of sexual education that I think is commonly missed because it's hard to teach. Like emotions are hard to understand, they're hard to speak about, and then it's not going to be taught in like school. So this is really up to you as a parent to teach your child. I love some of these questions. What is your immediate reaction when you think about sex? Do you feel happy, comfortable, anxious, sad, vulnerable? Right? Like look at yourself. How are you emotionally feeling about sex? How aware were you of the emotional side of sex before you became sexually active? What emotional changes do you think occur once someone becomes sexually active? Are there any emotions that you think are negative and should not be expressed? Right? Like all of these, how does emotion tie to relationships and sexual intimacy? This is a phenomenal thing to teach your child and can really help them understand like why sex is so important. If they see sex as just the creation of children, right? Well, then they're just like, okay, I can use a contraception and then it won't matter. But if they see sex as like having emotional risk and reward, that then gives that decision more weight, which can empower your child to just be conscious of that decision and take the time to think about the long-term effects of sex. Next is exploring sexual orientation. We all had different ideas about sexual orientation growing up, and I think a discussion about this between you and your partner really matters. I love this last question. What would your initial reaction be upon hearing that your child was gay? Just recently, actually, like today, I had someone call me because their older child was sexually abusing their younger child, which is just honestly heartbreaking. And as a parent, they're like, how do I deal with this, right? And I think these parents had this great direction. That like our goal is to help our child to feel like we love them, we support them, and we're going to help them for both the abuser and the abusee. I think that matters here too, you know? Like this is such a moment of like, what are my parents going to think of me? That my whole goal would be to speak love. And to just be like, I am so grateful that you told me. I'm grateful that you chose to be open. I'm grateful you shared that part of yourself with me. And I'm glad to be part of it. And I'm grateful to be your parent. This message of acceptance and love, and we are in this together, really does propel us forward into the future to let those conversations continue to be open instead of it just being a one-time thing or something that's secret and is happening outside of your parent-to-child conversation. Finally is this like exploring communication, which is more talking about relationships, right? But a big part of that is like sexual communication is a big part of it, right? This last question, what do you think is the most effective way to communicate your family values about sex to your child? Right? And like, how do we talk about that? How often do we talk about sex? Like, what should communication look in a relationship? And then how does that teach our kids about what intimacy is supposed to be? Again, I love these pages. Like, and if you only did these questions as a partnership, like, this book would be so valuable because it helps us to think about and get on the same page previous to teaching that to our children, right? And even if we're not exactly on the same page, to know where each other are coming from and to be able to verbalize it really is powerful. Like, I get to practice verbalizing things as I tell them to my wife, and that makes it easier for me to then tell them to my child. The next section talks about your child's mental development. This really can help us with the when portion, right? Understanding the kind of base guideline and structure of a child's mental development can help us know like when to teach our child certain things and also what to expect from that child, right? I think at times we expect more than a child may be capable of in their specific stage. It goes through these different stages of cognitive development. Starts with sensory motor stage, right? The more that your child is just trying to connect with their body, they're trying to like, okay, movement, oh my goodness, I have a hand, I'm separate from my situation, the objects around me. But I like this advice she gives at the end. The more your child connects with his or her body during this time, the more they are physically connected to and nurtured by their primary caretakers, the more secure and comfortable they'll be in their body and their self-worth. So the goal here is like body connection and physical touch and making sure that we can help them feel that sense of worth. Next is pre-operational. This is from age 2 to 6-ish, and they're having more imaginary friendships. They think everyone around them sees the world exactly the same that they do. But I like this advice in this section. The more permissive you can be during this time, the better. Because this is the time when your child is really starting to make sense of his own body and to gain a sense of agency and control over it. This is a time for us to let our children explore and learn and be as permissive as possible as a parent and let that child, again, go and learn. And then concrete operational, right? And this is where this is 6 to 12, your kid is now able to logically understand the mechanics of sex. During this point, we'll be teaching both, like, where do babies come from, right? So, like, a little bit about sex, pregnancy, birth, and then also be teaching what is sex later on in this concrete operational stage. And then finally we move to this like former operational, right, where like the child finally gets to develop this like I can see the world, take in other people's views. But it really has an odd dichotomy here where like individuals are imagining that everyone around them is constantly judging them, and then also feels this like exaggerated belief that I'm unique and that I'm invincible. And so for kids, for teenagers at this point, like they don't really believe that negative things will happen to them, right? They think that like, oh yeah, that sucks that they got pregnant, but that doesn't really connect with them going, oh, I'm going to get pregnant too. And so this fear base of teaching is not going to stick for teenagers at that stage. And that's why she talks about this advice that I think is awesome. This is one of the primary reasons why it's a good idea to offer abstinence-based education rather than abstinence-only education. Like this is an important time to be teaching not just abstinence, right? But if it's an abstinence-based, then awesome, right? Like if that's your family value system, great, teach that. But abstinence-only education can be a little risky because a lot of times children, again, don't see themselves as at risk to whatever consequences that we may be teaching about sex, whether they're emotional, physical, especially when we talk about like the physical STDs and pregnancy risks. Like a lot of times kids go, oh, that would never happen to me. Our next session is called Discussing Values. She stresses from the very beginning, like this needs to be open and ongoing dialogue. And she talks about two different types of moments. One of these moments is like random teachable moments, right? Like you're there in a grocery store line and you see like a Cosmopolitan magazine and be like, well, that's not really real about sex, or whatever. But you have these like moments that are kind of a little more natural and built into normal life where we're talking about what relationships are, what intimacy is, and what sex is. But then she also talks about like the importance of planned conversation. And she talks about having one of those between around 11 and 12. In my opinion, there's a couple of these planned conversations that you want to have happen. One of them is like where babies come from, where we teach like sex, pregnancy, and birth. And this is around like 7 years old, 7 years old. Then around like 8 years old, we're hitting like puberty, and that should be a planned conversation. Like this is what's going to happen to your body. We're either going to like read books about it, we're going to talk about it in some way. And then later around like 10, 11 is maybe when we would hit like these are the emotional and relationship consequences of sex, and like what is sex instead of where do babies come from, but again, what is sex, right? And then again, probably around like 12, 13ish, I want another formal conversation about like what does a relationship look like? What's happening in the relationship world, right? And that's something that you'd be talking about before, but maybe a little bit more formally around this 11 to 12 years old time. But the focus is to have both of those, to have these planned conversations where we teach values and these like open conversations where they just randomly come up and we talk about what we agree with and what we maybe don't. Before our child thinks they know more than us, that is the time to be teaching our values. And we're teaching them in many ways, just by the way that we're living. We're teaching them verbally, right? And that matters. But we're hoping to have most of that taught by the time our kid's like 13, 14 years old. Then we are going to want them to express and work out their value system that they're building in our presence. The awesome thing that I see, and this, I don't know if this book really talks about it, but the awesome thing that I see with parents that teach early is that when these have these conversations later, the kid is saying like, oh yeah, my friends are in relationships and I know some of them are having oral sex, but that kid in their brain is going, oh, this is what my mom would say about oral sex. And you even don't have to say anything as a parent because that child has already anticipated what you're going to say. And they're probably pretty close to right. And if they don't know, they'll ask. And so if you've taught these values early, you'll notice that whenever you talk to your kids about these kind of things, those old conversations will come back up in their head, and you'll see them consider in their head, oh, what would my mom or my dad think about this? As she gets to this reflecting on sex portion, She talks about giving our child space to develop their own sexual values. And I think it's important that we're not always teaching, especially as we get past this like teenage phase, right? We're like 14, 15, 16, 17. Like, that's the time for our children to be developing their own values. She gives us an example of giving a journal to their child and being like, look, understand that like not all of your sexual thoughts are going to want to be shared with me. Like, this is a place where you can record them and think about them. And I think that's important that you think about what you want and that kind of stuff, right? And again, like, we want to do all we can to help our child feel empowered, that they are the chooser and they get to decide what their life is going to be like. And as we empower them to be a chooser, they will own that choice and make that choice according to their value systems and not because of the value system or the pleasure chase of their friends. And so we want to do, again, all we can in that moment to give our child space to develop their values and ask questions that could help them to think about what they really want or what they think about what's going on, right? Like, I love asking teens about their friends and then about what they think about what their friends are doing, right? And that is a moment that they're assessing their value system and deciding what they want moving forward. The next portion on page 66 is talking about sexual orientation. The first section talks about some like studies behind homosexuality, and really she wraps up by saying that like they don't really know where. Like, there's beliefs about a bunch of different things, whether it's a gene or how much testosterone is in the uterus and like all these different things. But really, I want to go to the next set of pages when they talk about sexuality on page 68 and 69. There's two major things that I think really matter here. One is they talk about that like this is a fluid thing. Like, so often a kid's trying to put a label on it, or their parents try to put a label on it, or other kids are trying to label other kids, and like it's fluid, right? Like, we are all wondering who we are, what we're attracted to, what we want to do, how we want to live our life. And that's part of growing up. And those likes and dislikes are very fluid. I really like on the bottom of page 69 that progression, the rating of your sexuality, right? And allowing that to be fluid. And as a parent, when a kid tells you that they're whatever they are and they decide to label themselves, like, as a parent, I would reassure you that it's fluid and it's going to change, and allow space for that change. In the first paragraph on page 69, I like this portion. Remember that regardless of your feelings on homosexuality, you can't control your child's sexual orientation. What you can do is help build their self-esteem. Again, like, you don't get to choose this for your child, but you can help your child have confidence in who they are and space to figure that out. I think it's so important for us to help our child feel our confidence in them and also have us feel confident in the way that they can choose. And we're giving them that space to make choices of who they choose to become. We can help build self-esteem, but we cannot choose our child's sexual orientation. Again, just a reminder about that fluidity and the scale, that like this is ever shifting. And I think it's important for us to see it that way, which can help our child to see it that way, and to avoid from labeling themselves, which can make them start to feel trapped, right? And it doesn't have to be defined when they're a kid. There is space for choice and adjustment and figuring these who am I questions out. This next section is entitled Puberty and Emotional Changes. The first thing that she talks about on page 70 is how a child is changing and they have so many hormones that, like, as a parent, it's helpful for us to just understand that this is a new experience for them too. Like, the emotion is more charged. It's hard for them as much as it's hard for us to maybe be around someone who has these emotional struggles. I love this line that is in that page 70. This lack of judgment should not excuse bad behavior, but it does help you to know where your teenager is coming from. They aren't crazy, just highly emotional and running on hormones, not logic. And I think understanding that matters so that we can give our child space to become more like an adult. On page 71, it talks about emotional release. There's a specific section on boys. It talks about like how to talk about hormones and emotional release. But there's a couple of sections I would like to read. One of the best ways to get emotional release is to make your house a safe place to express emotion. This means that all emotions should be encouraged. Many of us think of emotions as either positive or negative. We tend to shun emotions that we think of as negative, such as sadness, anxiety, or fear, all of which come with the territory for teens. However, the truth is there is no such thing as a negative or positive emotion. Every feeling is part of the human experience, and all are worth exploring and expressing. Emotional outbursts tend to happen as a result of holding emotion in for too long, then releasing it all at once. As a parent, I want to give that space to talk about emotion. And one thing that I've learned is that as I'm more open about how I feel, it helps my children to feel more safe and then encourages them to share as well. The other day we were driving home and my kids were in the back seat and they were like playing / screaming at each other, but like you couldn't tell if it was mad or if they were just having fun. And the loudness was just like getting to me. And eventually I just said out loud, like, I am getting anxious because of the loud noises. And my kids, you'd think that they would feel like a little stressed by that, but it actually relaxed them to know where I was at, right? And then that is encouraging my kids to also be able to speak the way that they feel. And if that speaking the way you're feeling is happening, then the chances of a build up to a blow up really does decrease. On page 72, it talks a little bit about getting through to your child, like having a child that maybe doesn't want to talk about the way that they feel. She talks about that's kind of a required part of growing up. Like her body, their body, your teen's body is telling them to separate from authority and set your own value systems and become your own. And we really want to increase that independence and help those children to have a chance to choose and fail, which we'll get back to. But they talk about here that one of the best things that you can do to help your child become more open with you is to do consistent things together. She suggests like video games and watching movies or hiking or Sunday dinner or tennis or whatever. But that consistency is going to fuel those open conversations. And having, again, a consistent time with that child is really going to help. Now, as we get to this increasing independence, part of this is really difficult because teenagers feel really frustrated during puberty because they think that they're adults and they think they should be able to make the decisions and the freedom of an adult, but their brain isn't really there yet. And so there's a hard balance. But as a parent, we really do want to foster them as a chooser and give them space to choose within the framework of health in your family. Now, this is a difficult thing, but I think for me, remembering that like this is the safest time for my kid to fail. Like my kid may struggle with pornography or may struggle with like drugs or may struggle with like friends or maybe even an eating disorder or the way that they think about themselves or self-harm or whatever. But like the safest place for them to struggle with that is in our home if we're aware of it. And I understand that failure is scary as a parent, but failure in a semi-safe place is a great place to learn. And that really will enable our kids moving forward. One of the highlights that I also liked was on page 75. There's this section number 5 says, what else can help minimize or prevent these emotional outbursts? And it talks about eating healthy. This is something I noticed for me individually, is I eat like sugary or too many processed foods. I spike and I have these moments of energy and then these crashes. And emotionally, it seems to do something very similar where I'm like really positive or really negative, but it's very large variance. But when I eat more healthy foods, like my emotional stability increases. And the one thing that we can really do to help with that is to just make those foods available. And when those foods are available and like easily eaten, our children will choose them. A lot of times kids choose processed or sugary foods because they're available. All they have to do is walk in the pantry, open up a package, and eat, right? And if we can make our healthy foods available in a similar way, our children will make more healthy food choices. The last section of this chapter is called Encouraging Open Communication. Again, this kind of talks about the danger of lecturing a teenager. At a teenage phase, this child is trying to become independent. And so one of the best things that you can do is to just talk with your child about what's going on in their life. A lot of the times, kids don't want to talk about their own life because they're afraid of if they're going to get in trouble or not. But you can ask about their friends. You can ask about their peers. You can ask about their schoolmates. And most of the time, that will help a kid to open up. When you do need to set consequences for a child, a teenager, it's very helpful if they are very clear and pre-decided, right? If there can already be a consequence, okay, if you're late for curfew, then this is the consequence. That really does help. And it helps a child to feel like it's less that you're just deciding and punishing them, but when they chose to be late, they chose whatever consequence that's already set. The last thing I wanted to point out in this chapter is on page 77 where it says avoiding judgment. It talks about how difficult it is to have an open communication in their home, but it then talks about the way that we talk about other people's decisions, right? It says here at the very last, if you scorn other people's decisions, they will naturally worry that you will do the same to them. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, I can't believe that person did that, or you are kind of coming down on other people's choices, life choices, then when that child makes a decision that they know you don't like, the chances of them coming to you decrease significantly, right? And we want our child to know that we all make mistakes, and that one of the best things we can do with mistakes is speak about them, right? A mistake gets compounded by hiding and isolating from others. But when we make a mistake and then go to someone, it can actually deepen our connection and actually increase our connection and happiness. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Please share. This really helps us to succeed as a community as you share information like this. And if you ever feel like you could use some individual help, please set up a free consultation. You can visit us at our website at trueconnectionsrecovery.com and set up a free consultation there. Thank you.